My name is Mary, and I'm 42 years old. For the last 10 years, I've been married to Charles. We used to work together, but now we're in different branches of the same company. Charles is well respected at work, known for his responsibility, confidence, and ambition. His colleagues admire him, and he always strives to maintain a strong, polished image. By contrast, I tend to be more reserved, often staying out of the spotlight. So, it was a bit of a surprise when Charles, with his dynamic personality, took an interest in me. After 3 years of dating, he proposed with a lavish bouquet of roses, making me feel deeply cherished. I said yes without hesitation, eager to start our life together. However, just when I thought I had everything figured out, Charles introduced a twist. He wanted us to live with his parents. I hesitated. It wasn't what I had envisioned for our new life, but he convinced me, assuring me that his parents were warm, welcoming, and looking forward to it. Reluctantly, I agreed. For the past 8 years, I've lived with Charles's family in what was once his childhood home. It's an arrangement I never expected, definitely not what I imagined when I thought of married life. My mornings begin early, usually with my mother-in-law pointing out small flaws, like how I cleaned the front door. Even though I try to cook breakfast for everyone, her complaints persist, and I often end up scrambling to fix things before she heads off to work, feeling like little more than house help. My routine is exhausting. I wake up at 6 a.m. to get everything ready, even though my mother-in-law is home all day and doesn't pitch in. By the time I get back from my job, it's time to cook again, and by the end of the night, I'm so drained I fall asleep as soon as my head hits the pillow. This endless cycle has taken its toll. While I bust myself to maintain the house, my mother-in-law lounges in the living room, enjoying the breakfast I made. She reminds me to keep things spotless because she wants the neighbors to think highly of us. Despite the constant stress and lack of support from Charles, who stays out of these domestic struggles, this grueling routine shows no sign of stopping. My father-in-law, as always, pretends not to notice, burying his face in his newspaper, oblivious to the tension. Since moving in with his family, the stress has started to show in ways I couldn't have imagined. I've lost a lot of weight, and even my menstrual cycle has stopped, making it difficult to conceive. While my mother-in-law is clearly part of the problem, somehow, I'm the one who gets blamed for our inability to have children. There was a time when I took pride in my appearance, but now I barely recognize the woman in the mirror. The constant criticism from my mother-in-law, coupled with the changes in my body, has pushed me into a deep depression. I've become so accustomed to just giving in to her demands that I've lost all sense of resistance, feeling numb and lacking the energy to even think about leaving. The situation became even more unbearable when I received terrible news. My father had passed away unexpectedly in an accident. It had been years since I last visited my family, mainly because every time I mentioned wanting to go, Charles and my mother-in-law would express their displeasure. Now, faced with the sudden loss, I knew I needed to attend his funeral. When I told Charles and my mother-in-law that I had to go, their response was chilling. "We're not going," Charles said before I could even finish. "Let your family handle it." Their indifference struck me like a slap. I was so overwhelmed with grief and anger that all I could say was, "Understood." At the funeral, the room was filled with people who cared deeply about my father. He was well connected in the community, and the outpouring of love and sorrow was overwhelming. My mother, whom I hadn't seen in years, was shocked by how frail I looked. "Mary, what happened to you?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "You look so thin. Are you sick?" Seeing her distress made my heart ache, and I tried to reassure her. "No, Mom, I'm not sick." But inside, the concern on her face made me reflect on everything I'd been going through. I realized how utterly unsupported I had been by Charles and my mother-in-law. Even during such an important and painful time, it only fueled my frustration. "I have to tell you something," I confessed to her later, when we had a quiet moment together. "Living with my in-laws has been harder than I ever imagined. My mother-in-law's constant bullying is wearing me down." She looked at me with deep concern. "Is that why you haven't been visiting? I wish you'd told me sooner," she said softly. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. She handed me a piece of paper. "Look at this," she said, "then think carefully about what you're going to do." It was my father's will. He had prepared it carefully, just in case, and I found a line that made my heart skip. The inheritance, $5 million. The shock of it lifted me, even if only for a moment. With this money, I could finally leave my in-laws' house and start fresh. The thought of building a life for myself, one free from the oppressive weight of my current situation, was suddenly a very real possibility. Back at the in-laws' house, I went about my usual chores, but now, my mind was consumed with the idea of that inheritance. The house, however, seemed messier than ever, with no one else stepping in to help. My thoughts kept drifting back to the $5 million, which felt like my ticket out. Despite the tension and my overwhelming desire to leave, I still felt loyalty to Charles. One evening, after his parents had gone to bed, I decided it was time to have an honest conversation with him. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, breaking the silence. Charles looked up expectantly. "It's about my father. He left me an inheritance," I said. "How much?" he asked, his tone curious. $5 million, I replied. Charles's face lit up with excitement. "That's a lot. We should talk about how to use it." For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Finally, a chance to talk about building a future together. But just as I was about to suggest we use the inheritance to buy our own place, Charles's expression shifted. "We need to transfer it to my mom's account right away," he said, his tone firm. I was taken aback. "What? Why would we do that? It's my inheritance. It wouldn't be right to give it to your mom." Charles slammed his hand down on the table, his face turning red. "What are you talking about? A wife's money belongs to her mother-in-law." His words were so absurd that I almost couldn't believe it. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," I said, bewildered. "I thought we'd talk about our future, but all you want is to give my inheritance to your mom?" Before I could say more, he cut me off. "I'm serious," he said coldly. "If you don't transfer that money to her, we're getting a divorce." He threw a piece of paper on the table, the divorce papers, already signed. "Take it, and go back to your parents' house. Maybe if you apologize, I'll reconsider," he added, his tone final. Stunned, I took the papers from his hands. The weight of it all crashed down on me. I realized that in all the years of our marriage, I had never truly received any support from him. I had always contributed equally to our living expenses, but every household chore was mine to handle. Despite my tireless efforts, I was never appreciated, and now, they wanted to claim my inheritance. The pressure to give up my father's legacy was immense, but the thought of walking away, starting over, filled me with a strange sense of relief. Holding the divorce papers, I realized that for the first time, I had control over my future. When I returned to my parents' house, I stood in the doorway, whispering to myself, "I'm home. Welcome back," I called out as my mother greeted me with a warm smile, despite the exhaustion that lingered in my bones. A comforting, home-cooked meal awaited me on the table, something I hadn't experienced in ages. With every bite, I could feel the weight of gratitude and relief wash over me. Tears threatened to spill as I savored the simple joy of eating a meal someone else had lovingly prepared. "Did you tell Charles about the inheritance?" my mother asked gently, as she watched me. "Yes, and it caused quite a scene," I replied, recounting the demands my husband and mother-in-law had made. My mother listened in silence, her shock palpable as I unfolded the details. "The inheritance is yours, Mary. You earned it. It's your right to decide what happens next," she said, her voice calm but firm as I fought back tears. After spending a week in the comfort of my parents' home, I felt a renewed sense of strength. It was time to go back, to face the family I had left behind, but this time, I would do so on my own terms. "Well, I'm heading back now. Take care," I said, my voice steady, no longer afraid of the battles that awaited me. When I returned, Charles and my mother-in-law were waiting, their expressions tight with impatience. "Have you thought about what you've done?" they demanded. "Yes, and I'm sorry. Please, let me stay here again," I offered, my apology more of a strategic maneuver than a heartfelt apology. My mother-in-law's face lit up with a mix of expectation and triumph. "Well then, hand over the inheritance quickly," she said, almost breathless with anticipation. I kept my composure, explaining, "The inheritance process is taking longer than expected. I haven't received it yet. It's a complicated procedure, and it might take another 7 months or so." 7 months? That long? My mother-in-law's disappointment was evident, but she reluctantly accepted my explanation. Both she and Charles seemed satisfied, thinking they had everything under control. They didn't know, though, that I was done playing by their rules. I wasn't about to hand over a penny of my inheritance, no matter how much they pressured me. You're neglecting your duties as a wife. The house is a mess. Get to work, they insisted, as if a week without me had somehow caused the house to fall into complete chaos. The disarray, the unwashed dishes, the unkempt corners, it was almost impressive, but I didn't care. In the past, this would have deeply upset me, but now, I simply carried out their orders without letting it affect me emotionally. My birthday's coming up, so I'll be leaving for a trip, my mother-in-law announced, as she always did. Make sure the house is clean before I go. Naturally, I wasn't invited on the trip. Oh, and have you received the inheritance yet? It's supposed to come in today, Charles asked, almost too conveniently. I could hear the unspoken hope in his voice. He must have been picturing the $5 million as the perfect birthday gift for his mother. Don't forget to transfer it to my account before we get back, my mother-in-law added, almost with a command. The timing was too perfect, the inheritance supposedly arriving on the same day as her birthday, but I didn't flinch. With a polite smile, I sent them off, waving them goodbye. As soon as they were out of sight, I sprang into action. My plan, the one I had been quietly formulating for months, was finally coming to fruition. I packed my things quickly, determined to leave my in-laws' house behind for good. Wow, this is incredible, I exclaimed as I settled into my new home, the one I had built with my father's inheritance. The joy and relief I felt were overwhelming. Finally, a space I could call my own, free from the oppressive atmosphere of my former home. I decided to share my new life with my mother, who lived in my hometown. The sense of peace that flooded me when I walked into my new home was indescribable. As I sank into the soft cushions of my new sofa, I realized how much I had missed true comfort and tranquility. To celebrate this fresh start, my mother and I treated ourselves to a day of indulgence. We hired a private chef, enjoying food that was as much about the experience as the meal itself. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. That evening, my phone rang. It was Charles, and his voice was thick with frustration. "What the hell is going on? Where are you?" he demanded, clearly confused by the empty house. "I'm not coming back, goodbye," I replied firmly, hoping to end the conversation there, but before I could hang up, my mother-in-law's voice pierced through the line, shrill and angry. "Where are you now? What are you doing?" she barked. "You asked me to clean the house, so I packed up my things," I said, my tone calm, unruffled by her fury. "You can't be serious. You didn't transfer the inheritance. How many times do I have to tell you? A daughter-in-law's money is mine," she screamed. I'm single, you know," I said, my patience wearing thin. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, as if she couldn't process what I had just said. "Single," she repeated, her voice faltering. "Yes, I'm divorced," I confirmed, holding up the divorce papers I had signed. "I'm a stranger to you now, goodbye." With that, I ended the call. The weight of what I had just done began to settle in, and for the first time in years, I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of my mother-in-law's stunned expression. I was free. Finally, I was free. In the days that followed, Charles tried to reach me countless times. Each time, I answered, letting him scream his insults while I calmly ignored his tirade. I made sure to record every call. With the recordings in hand, I decided it was time to take action. Harassment from an ex-husband was common, and I wasn't about to let it ruin my peace. I went to the police, who took immediate action, visiting my ex-husband's family. The police presence was enough to send shockwaves through my in-laws, especially because they were so focused on their public image. A colleague of Charles's, who lived nearby, saw the police at their door, and word spread quickly. Fueled by those who resented him, negative gossip began to circulate about him, and it didn't take long for the whispers to reach my department. "Did you hear about the police visit to Charles's family?" colleagues whispered, their voices full of intrigue. "I wouldn't know," I replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm divorced now, so I'm not really in the loop." The gossip spread like wildfire, and before long, my ex-husband's boss heard about the incident. During a tense meeting, his boss remarked, "You've been the subject of some damaging rumors, haven't you?" Charles, blindsided, could only protest. "What are you talking about? I can't tolerate men who don't appreciate their wives," his boss replied, "and these rumors could harm the company's reputation. You're being transferred." The transfer was harsh, he was moved to a remote branch office in the most underperforming region of the company, a place where he would have no hope of career advancement. It was a severe blow to everything he had worked for. As for my mother-in-law, she was likely blindsided by the sudden shift in her son's career, not to mention the sudden isolation she now faced. Over time, she became withdrawn, and it wasn't long before signs of depression and even dementia began to show. My father-in-law, now tasked with caring for her, often remarked, even without blood ties, a daughter-in-law is still family. As for me, I've never been happier, living with my mother. We've started a new hobby, gardening. It has given me a sense of purpose and peace I never knew was possible. My physical health, which had suffered under the stress of my previous life, is now improving as well. Every day, I'm grateful for the strength I found to leave that toxic household behind and embrace a life that is truly my own.